Hello, this is John Spink. I'm Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and an Assistant Professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And this is my presentation estimating the economic impact of food fraud for the Food Safety Regulatory Economics Working Group here in Washington, D.C., March 11th, 2019. I'll begin. First off, it's really interesting to start to look at economic impacts, and there's been a lot of efforts around the world to address this for overall counterfeiting and piracy, and it's beginning to be a question that's asked again about food fraud. And so what I feel is really need to go back and look at the root questions and really to ask, why do you need an estimate? Usually the whole estimate is undefined anyway, and the question is undefined. It's something general, like we should have an estimate, shouldn't we? And then really, but I'd say really why? You know, who's asking? Well, I'll say also who's paying and how much are they paying? So is it just a quick review, or is it something that they're looking in great detail? What's the extent of their unmet need? And you have to really dig into what will they do with this information? What decision are they supporting? And then, boy, now that you get to these questions, now what? And so I think my role here is to lay out where we have not had success in the past, where we have had success, what those decision-making processes are, and then really how data supports that need. So first, I think it's important to explain where I came from and how I look at this. So originally I have a BSMS in packaging science, it's material science mainly, but then I worked in industry for 12 years or so, worked for Chevron Corporation, so fourth largest company in the world, at least at one time, worked for a general manager there. That was a real key when it comes down to looking at these really thresholds of risk tolerance and resource allocation decision making. That's where I really learned the most. Worked for a small company as well, and then back at Michigan State, I've been teaching in the food safety program. It's an online graduate program for 15 years now. Then eventually I got my PhD in packaging, and that was actually anti-counterfeiting and product protection. And so that started to get into this area of counterfeiting in general, intellectual property, but then food fraud was an area I focused in on. I taught anti-counterfeiting grad course before I graduated, actually, focused on the counterfeiting and the root causes. And this was consumer electronics, pharmaceuticals, really overall IP was the main focus at the start. Now, overall, we looked at the root cause, and from, I think, the Chevron days, I dug back to say, why is this occurring? And it's really occurring, food fraud's occurring because of criminology. They're criminals. They're human adversaries. So there's a lot of things we can learn from social science and criminal justice of how they approach measuring crime prevention, measuring the impact of crime. I think it's a really important place to start, not in food. It's really looking at this as a crime problem and looking at it that way. Then when we're looking at addressing it, you're not just measuring it, crime, things, you're trying to reduce it. But in this case, the adversaries were humans and they were in a business. Now, it might be a criminal business enterprise, but still it was a business. Now, the other side of it is for decision making for our companies or governments as well, is looking at some way to measure this risk and figure out what's intolerable. And then that was what we found, is this lack of a focus on the decision led us to look at enterprise risk management and COSO, and we'll go into that in a little more detail later. So really what I've done, we're in this anti-counterfeiting, all products area, pharmaceuticals, other products, and then really we got into the application and really felt like we had to go really narrow. So when really the food industry was the one that was really picked up and took a big focus on this, because they realized they had just an astronomical vulnerability. And so this prevention approach made a lot of sense. It wasn't just identifying the problem or measuring it, it was looking at how to prevent it, and really a quality management system. So we really have this immersion in the interdisciplinary application. It's in academia, industry, and government. So like me being here is really an excellent venue. Just briefly about us, research, education, outreach. There's a cycle there, and that's how we do. Coming out here, we learn, go back and research. Actually, some good questions came up from this. You've challenged me quite a bit. First thing we have are free open online courses. They're called MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. So a number of them are an overview of food fraud, and we've got some more details. More of them are coming out. They're basically 2 2-hour webinars, and they're free, so they're easy to access. Second, we do executive education. We do all sorts of training, private and public, and work with people. We have graduate courses that cover food fraud in one way or another, and those can roll into a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention, and those can roll into a Michigan State online master's program. All of our courses are online, so anybody can access them anywhere. So to start out, this is a group of government audiences, and so it's important to look at what's going on around the world. And there's an awful lot going on. The Nordic countries currently have a group project, a funded government project, to do a vulnerability assessment for food fraud for the entire region, as well as the individual countries. So we're helping with that. And specifically, Norway is leading some of that and starting to work with them. Trinidad had an official inquiry on food fraud, and we did go down there for a week. And one thing that what we completed is a country-level food fraud vulnerability assessment. So in a lot of ways, they're leading the world, most progressive, with the base foundation, the direction, the drive, and really getting these fundamentals. UK has a food crime unit, only focuses on, it's really food fraud, but they say food crime. China has been doing a lot for a long time. Canada has a food fraud work group, which is looking at a recommendation for the government. Ireland has a big focus on food fraud. So I say FDA, it's FSA. But New Zealand had activity. European Commission has a food fraud network that meets on a regular basis. Interpol Operation Opsin is global. U.S. does participate in that. And then Codex Alimentarius is working on definitions of food fraud, which would then lead the future research there. And FDA has a work group on EMA since about 2009 or so. So there's a lot of activity going on. I think a lot to learn about what is working and really mostly of what's not working. And sometimes things start, but they just go in circles. And that's what we'll try to dig through here. Really, the first thing is to create a prevention strategy, and the strategy is to really review it and figure out what the strategy is, and that's what industry is doing. So there's a lot of good recommendations for you. So food fraud overview, just real briefly, if you're not familiar with this, it's important to lay it out. I'll cover it briefly. Intentional deception for economic gain using food. That's any deception for economic gain. And that's a pretty simple definition. I'll explain how it relates to other types of root causes of food problems. This definition is consistent with GFSI, that's the Global Food Safety Initiative. I'll get into that. The European Commission, UK, ISO, Codex, and others. That includes the subcategory of economically motivated adulteration, or EMA. And based on the working definition of FDA from the May 2009 public meeting, EMA is defined as a substance for economic gain. It's only a substance, but as you'll see, food fraud covers a lot more things than just a substance. The motivation is economic gain, but we will look broader than that because we've got to look at the root causes of how they make money. You're sick, but you don't know exactly the root cause of why you're sick. Something really important to mention right here, and we put it on this first slide, is food defense is different. It is completely different than food fraud in the motivation. The motivation for food fraud in general is traditionally harm or terror. And then food defense, as defined further by the intentional adulteration rule here in the U.S., is narrowed to wide-scale human health harm. So someone that's only trying to poison a couple people wouldn't be wide-scale harm, and that technically wouldn't be under intentional adulteration. There's always an economic threat, but there's not always a public health threat, and that's why there's been a lack of focus from, say, public health agencies, such as big food agencies, because the problem's there when the people are getting sick, it's a focus, and then it goes away, it's not. But the thing is, there's always a vulnerability. When someone's messing with the product, something bad could happen. There's a lot of examples, but we won't get into them right now. So what is food fraud? So this is from the Global Food Safety Initiative. And what we've got here are all the types of fraud that they've defined to be in scope. And the reason why that's important is because GFSI is essentially a requirement for industry to address. And food fraud is now a requirement for GFSI. So whether you like it or not, or you don't like one part of the definition or a company doesn't, bottom line is they have to do this to be compliant. Now maybe a future version of GFSI will change. It does not look that way. They've just reaffirmed last May this path. But it's looking at everything, because the key is the bad guys are looking at everything. Bad guys would rather just steal product and sell it than make counterfeits, because then they'd have less to do, less risk from the product. But these are all the root causes. Now, what we do see is a focus on the public health threat, which is this orange zone, and this is where the economically motivated adulteration range is. That's a focus from that working definition of FDA. But really, what we see is overall, all types of fraud are illegal in one way or another by everybody, and including the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so the FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, is based on and did not supersede, did not replace the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that included adulterated foods and misbranded foods. So misbranded foods are technically illegal. All these would be illegal under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Now, it may not be prioritized as a focus area, but it would be illegal. So, when we're looking at the root cause, the motivation, why this occurs, we need to be very specific. So we look at the at different types of things here on the food risk matrix. Food safety and food defense were pretty well understood, and we were working in that area quite a bit. But when we started to look at food counterfeiting or food fraud, we found that looking at the root cause and preventing it was fundamentally different because the motivation is different. We also include food quality here because for a company or a country, food quality is probably going to be the biggest cost anyway. You know, every minute that goes by, there's food quality costs at a company. So right here is every single risk of food related to food for a country or a company. And that's the key. And so we've got to define these boxes as very, very specific. On one side is unintentional, that action. The other side is intentional. For food defense, the intent is public health, economic, or terror. It's harm. They're trying to hurt somebody else. Maybe to be able to hurt them financially, but that's the key. For food fraud, the motivation is economic gain for themselves. Now we're getting to a very specific detail of why we're focusing on this issue. So wide-scale harms, intentional adulteration rule is a subcategory under all food defense, and EMA is a subcategory under there. And this was something that actually Dr. Ostroff, who was then first commissioner of all FDA in April 2017 when he presented on this, and then later in October. Also, just of note that the GFSI food fraud think tank Walmart was a member, and your new deputy commissioner for food safety of FDA was one of the executive sponsors from GFSI for that. Now, I'm not making any connections there, but that's just a side note, as I say. This is not to read through. These are references for you. They're in the slide deck. You have them. You can take screenshots, or you've got the video here. And so we've got all the definitions if you need them. We have a glossary of definitions related to food fraud that's over 850 words, said terms or concepts. So you can look at that to your heart's content. But something to look at specifically is, again, EMA is a substance for economic gain. Food authenticity is the food says what it is. Food integrity is the product is of the specification defined, such as quality or label claims. So those are two different things. It's that it meets the specification, and that it's really tested to be official there. Now, it's important to look at food crime because this is a term that gets confused quite a bit. There's two definitions. One is the general definition, which incidents involving food that is a violation of a criminal statute. So that also, maybe there's something that's not a criminal statute, and that could narrow it down. And then another definition is the UK using food crime as all types of food fraud that is conducted on a large scale. So small-scale food fraud would be food fraud. Large scale, they would call it more as a crime. So really, in general, using the term food fraud is really clearer because there's a lot of these discrepancies in the definitions. So we'll use food fraud. Compliance dates. So when we're looking at what data we need, one thing is interesting to look at what is required and when is it required and is it required yet. So the key is GFSI. So approximately 65% of the world trade are members of GFSI, and they're usually at the end of the supply chain, so they require their supply chains to have a food safety management system. And the ones you might know are FSSC, SQF, BRC, or IFS. It was a requirement, not optional, January 2018. It requires a food fraud vulnerability assessment for all types of fraud. It requires a food fraud prevention strategy for all products. So industry's already doing this. And so you can kind of piggyback on what they're doing and watch. Now, a key with GFSI is no documents equal audit nonconformance. And so companies can lose their food safety certification if they didn't meet these food fraud requirements. GFSI, other people mentioned it earlier, but there wasn't a lot of implementation of it. FSMA requires it back really in September 2016 because, quoted there from CFR, the hazard analysis must be written regardless of its outcome. So if you said, well, stolen goods aren't really a problem, well, you'd have to document that to explain it. And you say, well, that doesn't apply to food fraud, right? Wrong. Right there in item number 3, the hazard may be intentionally introduced for the purposes of economic gain. So this is crystal clear. Well, I don't know if it's crystal clear, but once you look, it doesn't say food fraud, but the law is very clear that you must conduct a hazard analysis for all types of hazards, and you can't say something's not a hazard unless you've conducted a hazard analysis. Now, of course, FDA and the food safety laws are going to focus on the things that are the most dangerous from a public health standpoint. We think back to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, 1938. So all types of food fraud have been illegal since at least 1938, and that's adulterated foods, misbranded foods. And there's other sections in some of these, such as smuggling or other types of acts. So food fraud has been clearly illegal in the U.S. since way, way back then. Something that kind of in parallel is Sarbanes-Oxley, and this is risks to the financial status of companies. That's required since 2002, and food fraud is fraud, and it's business fraud. It could affect a business, so it was really required back then. ISO 22000 does include a note that it does require scope for food fraud and food defense. There's a number of ISO standards, and this is really in the product fraud area that do cover product fraud in one way or another. Codex Alimentarius, I mentioned that. It's going to be defined. Now, GFSI, if you're not familiar with GFSI, just real quickly, so there were a lot of regulations around the world, and the Consumer Goods Forum, which were the CEOs of all products companies, I think there's over 300, but the food group of them said, hey, this is wacky. We need to have a central food safety management system. So they created a GFSI, and GFSI is the idea, the benchmark. They're not standards, but they set the scope of what a requirement of a standard is. So then standards companies create those actual documents, and I mentioned some of those before. Companies implement them, or governments, I guess you could say, and then an accredited third-party audit confirms it. Now, key is that if a government requires a process, so FSMA already requires it. So if FDA just confirms, yeah, you do need to have a hazard analysis for everything, including all acts for harm, then what it does is it actually just requiring a process, not prescribing a process. That actually then really does support the regulations, and then a cycle occurs here. And that will just keep this getting more and more refined, and the product and marketplace getting more and more secure. So when we start to, again, look at what data are we collecting, what are the decisions, how are we figuring out how bad is bad? Enterprise risk management. So this came out of Sarbanes-Oxley, and it's a U.S. regulatory requirement. Well, it's really now for all companies, and even at private companies. Someone doesn't give you $1 billion and say, hey, hope for the best, see you in a year. Then there's some type of internal controls. And it's really a standard for financial reporting. It helps look at control surprises and manage across the entire business. And the key for us, a big breakthrough is this cube, this ERM cube or COSO cube. This is how all the activities interrelate within a company. And a key point here is event identification. So if you are saying food fraud, how bad is it, or a new incident occurs, it would enter here, and there would be a systematic process for review. Now, some companies have more formal processes than others, but a key is there is a process. Accountants are being trained this at school. So we'll expand back into ERM a little bit. A key is under overall risk analysis. You do the hazard identification. You look at this decision making. There's a risk tolerance. We're not zero risk. We're not, every single crime isn't addressed. What we need to have is some type of threshold to review. So when an incident does occur, we can identify if it's A, B, or C in these A, B, or C zones. So this is responding, and this is starting to define what information and data we need. We need to be able to define this risk tolerance, and that's looking at the likelihood and consequence. And that's a real key, what we look at with incidents, and start to try to understand that. Now, we really define this zone by experience. When the Congress goes crazy for something, then we know that it's above the risk tolerance. When there's this focus, then that's how we really define this. And over time, companies have become more refined to really understand these in a lot more detail, which really drives decision making and resource allocation at the very front lines. And let's look at decision making again. So this is basic ISO 31000. We didn't make this up. Establishing the context. That's the key point, I think, right here with this group. You are establishing the context of what question you're addressing. Once you identify what question you're addressing, then you can go about getting the right information. And that gets into risk identification, looking at what's going on there, hazard identification, hazard analysis, how this is conducted, and this is the hazard evaluation. Again, this gets to be the point where you collect information and you start to learn what information would change decisions, more resource allocation or taking resources away even. And then this risk treatment, what you do, the actual action and the expenditures, and then it cycles. For food fraud, we've had to dig this in for companies and really look at a process. So what we've got is a food fraud prevention cycle, and this is under review at an academic journal. And so what we've got here is everything's connected to everything. We've got the basic ideas of academic disciplines, fundamental concepts, but a key is this cycle here. Information comes in, that's where you are. Data. Information comes in. There's this review of the fraud opportunity. We look at assessment. We conduct those risk assessments. Enterprise risk leads us to establish a rank. And that will then come back to identify changes in data. This applies to governments as well. And that might seem kind of far off to look at this whole idea of this enterprise risk and these risk tolerances, but it absolutely is. But you'll say, wow, that won't work for governments, right? Not so fast, my friends, as one sportscaster says. So the U.S. government has a number of reports on enterprise risk management. 2 GAO reports reviewing the application and implementation, which is successful in many places. And there's what's called the Green Book. It's commonly used name for standards for internal control in the federal government. So it does exist. You've got the framework. You're not creating anything new. This is the structure where you'd go look to see what decisions are made and what information would be needed there. There's a risk tolerance. And that's a real key that all hazards aren't prevented. We look for hazards that require preventive control. And we have to really understand this risk tolerance. That's where I think this economic analysis and the analysis data collection really can contribute the most. What is an internal control, though? But it's defined as a process used by management to help an entity achieve its objectives. And that objective is to keep those risks within the risk tolerance. That's the most bottom line issue there. So and one of those risks could be your budget, but it's also meeting whatever societal or regulatory, statutory requirements you have on your enterprise. Then there's this objectives and limits. So management has an oversight body that looks at this. And then the key is there's these principles already in there. So you're not making anything up that's new. You're just really, this is establishing the context. You're looking to define objectives and look for those risk tolerances. Management defines the risk tolerances in specific and measurable terms so they are clearly stated and can be measured. Key, measured. And so now we've got a risk tolerance, and now we're looking at how the decision is being made and the information and data we need to make those decisions. So, why are we counting what? Okay, so now we know that there's this risk tolerance kind of idea out there. But what are the factors that increase food fraud? Now, this is an entire dissertation in and of itself, but one thing that we look at here is the crime triangle. The root cause is this fraud opportunity. And it's Criminology 101, looking at this situational crime prevention, a number of articles, including ours here. It looks at a suitable target, likely offender, those fraudsters, and the absence of a capable guardian. These are what help us understand the fraud opportunity at the very center. Now, again, this is an entire separate study to look at what leads this fraud opportunity to occur, but that is really a subject for a different day. Just knowing that there's a real body of research out there that we can leverage is really key. So, estimating the economic impact of food fraud. Let's look at the foundational concepts. I love this slide. And this was from Bob Ross, who was one of the directors of risk analysis for DHS early on. This was 2010 when we saw this. Not everything that can be counted counts. Not everything that counts can be counted. So let's add, this is the way most food fraud estimates or counterfeiting estimates add up. So look at this right here. Established 1967 elevation, population, total. It makes no sense to add them up. They don't make any sense. But someone did. So it's funny to see that. And that's the way I think that when we look at some of these economic impacts, there's a lot of information put together that just makes no sense. So we have to really look at when we're looking at economics, is what is economics? the definition. This is like intellectually offensive to go back and even look at this, because we all know what this means, right? Well, let's look. The first definition from Webster's is analysis of the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. I would say that that's traditional economics, agricultural economics. What we're looking at here is the economic aspect or significance. So the harm on an enterprise, of an entire economy or enterprise. So it's really key to point out we're not looking at this broad, the analysis of production and consumption. We're looking at this significance. That's different. So early on, we saw big problems because there were a lot of estimates, and when we dug into them, there was not a lot of rigor. And I'll show one of the articles we wrote 2012. As a result of, after GAO reports on the topic, and we'll cover that as well. But this is what we saw as a root cause, or kind of general areas. 5 to 7% of world trade, that's what's really used. That's the bottom line. Almost every estimate of counterfeiting is based on 5 to 7% of world trade. It doesn't matter where it comes from, where it's going, who bought it, who watched it, the supply chain controls, 5 to 7% is often the base. But and there's another saying that only 5 to 10% of that is luxury goods. And so that's interesting, but we look at the root cause of that, and a lot of times it's really not based in data. 10% of all drugs worldwide, and medicines are going to grow to 46 billion in 2000, or from 46 billion to 75 billion. Wow, that's really big. But we need to look at the assessment. 1 to 3% of the U.S. drug supply. That starts to get scary. What are we talking about here? Counterfeits? Actually, they're talking more about a diverted product that might be more patent infringement, or generics that aren't supposed to be sold. And then there's this estimate that really is the root of a lot of estimates, 49 billion, and that was in a newspaper article as an estimate. And there again, the UK level of fraud is about 10% with no other data. And I will say that we're contributing to this as well, because we've had a number of citations leading to us of 50 billion or 30 to 40 billion or others. A key is defining fraud. If you're talking all fraud or just stolen goods or counterfeits, and the citation for this was just an open panel discussion at GFSI. So, why unknowable? So we've got all these different types of definitions. So this was it's clandestine, confidential or classified information, limited sharing of customs or seizure data, differences in seizure definitions, and tougher to detect. And that's a real key. The bad guys are working pretty hard to deceive us. We know what we seized, but we don't know what we didn't seize. And that's really a bottom line. A lot of times the data that you're collecting, you're summarizing what you found, but you really don't have any idea what you didn't find. Overall, looking at quantifying the economic impact, you got seizure data, you've got known fraud, and then you've got all fraud. And this is why it's a challenge, because those in the blue are the knowns. We really don't know the rest, because we sometimes think it's unknowable because we've got, another thing is some of the data that we have. Some of the product, they find counterfeits, but it's not seized. It might be seized, but it might be prosecuted as smuggling or IP or others. So we really don't have a lot of good data. Seizures may only represent counterfeit products from fraudsters who are sloppy or unlucky, a sacrificial loss to distract investigation resources from other products, or a test of the vigilance and diligence of the guardians. So bad guys are doing an awful lot of things, and it's challenging from a data standpoint to know what we really found. So we'll look at the GAO report. They started this report on the economic impact, but I've got to mention that it began as a report to create an estimate of the economic impact, and the focus changed to just look at the efforts to quantify, not quantifying it, just how these measures were there. 3 widely cited U.S. government estimates of economic losses resulting from counterfeiting cannot be substantiated due to the absence of underlying studies. Because of significant differences in the types of counterfeit and pirated goods and industries involved, no single method can be used to develop estimates. Each method has limitations, and most experts observed that it is difficult, if not impossible, to quantify the economy-wide impacts. That's key. So GAO learned from them and learned from the predecessors that this is a challenging question. If you jump in, you have no idea how deep it is and what sharks are swimming in the water. So learn from the past. A key is that we start to look at what we do need for data, and that's why we really need to dig in the question itself. Now, something else I'd like to point out is Congressional Research Service. They did a great report, very thorough. Actually, I don't remember the year, but they defined food fraud, and they said that there was no really U.S. definition, but no single agency covers it, and that FSMA really does recognize these third-party audits. So a key from a food agency standpoint is reinforcing FSMA through those hazard analysis. So if you're going to address food fraud, that's a really important way to do it. But again, our research question here today is about estimating the impact. But so CRS does have some background for you on that. So why the big challenge? So what's the big deal with all this? Well, we had an article, and a couple things that we really pointed out. Lack of historical data. You think there's a lot of data out there? There is not. Go look. Where would you look? And you think that, oh, well, we just didn't look hard enough. Well, the thing is that there's not some data set for this. And even the big incident databases for food fraud are really, there's very, very few incidences out there, actually. And the key is that every incident, really, literally every incident is different. And even if it's later in time, there's things in place. So you really can't compare them. It's really challenging. The incomplete and often inaccurate nature of the available data. So the data set is really just everything you could find. And then some of that is miscategorized as well. Seemingly arbitrary infringements by the counterfeiters. Data uncertainty created by the data generator, which in this case is a human. So criminals are basing their activity on their specific circumstances. A lot of times it's very different. We don't even know what the circumstance is. If somebody's cousin stole a truckload of chicken or steaks or whatever, that would be their fraud opportunity. And that's really, really challenging to understand. This is very hard because the criminals are very, very adaptive to their environment. Model uncertainty, which is also referenced as formulation errors. This happens constantly. And one of the keys there is the root of the data set. And that's something we'll go into next. Sources of the estimates. So there was this 5 to 7% of world trade, that's Counterfeiting Intelligence Bureau. And then the OECD. So what we did is we looked at all the major reports that are out there. We found at that time we found 49 that were government or something very, very formal. And what we found is they went back to these 4 sources of the estimates: OECD, or Counterfeiting Intelligence Bureau, OECD, FBI had an estimate of 200 to 250 billion, but that was in a press release that got taken down fairly quickly. And so that had no background estimate and then no citation. So it's really kind of complex to see here, but it's basically everything went through to those base 4 estimates, including the FBI. The FBI was a source for 3 of those articles. And so that's the source. Now that we've found the source, let's go look more closely at both of those, especially the first 2. So in their estimates, there were disclaimers. So each of the reports was exactly clear and very, very competent in the way that they addressed this. The Counterfeiting Intelligence Bureau, which is, again, the 5 to 7% of world trade, is the biggest estimate used. The overall cost of counterfeiting the world today is generally estimated between 5 to 7% of world trade. There we go. While there is not clear data to support these percentages, they are now widely accepted and used to illustrate the extent of the counterfeiting problem. They say it right there. Even though they say it's probably generally considered there, they're saying there's really no estimate of it. And the previous report in 1997 said the same thing. Second is OECD. The report emphasized the difficulty in product counterfeiting data collection, stating the overall degree to which products are being counterfeited and pirated is unknown. Now, is that kind of known? A little known? It's unknown. And there do not appear to be any methodologies which could be employed to develop an acceptable overall estimate. Boom. I mean, what more do you want? I don't know how much they spent on that. A number of governments spent millions contributing into that OECD report, and that's the outcome. Oh, yeah, the economic impact of counterfeiting piracy. Oh, yeah, there do not appear to be any methodologies. But I think we need to ask those basic questions first. And then there was another estimate that we've seen out there that's a business fraud estimate, and it's based on this general business fraud estimate of 5.85%. That's the root. So when they get to this food fraud estimate, it's based on 5.85%. Well, something to point out there as well is look at that. That's not 5%. It's 5.85%. That's 3 significant figures. Wow. That is very, very precise. But the starting point is not the food industry, not a food fraud estimate. Reality check. Application of the analysis. An illustration of this concern is that the study concludes, so they have a study that concludes the chance of an imported product from Morocco being counterfeit. That's good detail, right? With a 95% confidence. All right, excellent, great. Is between 3 and 97%. So the 95% confidence, that's more specific, so that's great. But let's think about the application. It is unclear how this assessment could be used other than to support the notion that the report states that general concern of products from Morocco. They're saying that if you buy a product from Morocco, you have between a 3 and 97% chance that it's counterfeit. And what is yeah, so you think there's a lot of counterfeits from there. And so some of the level of detail is kind of extreme. And so we'd have to question the usefulness there. So why do you need an economic impact number? This really gets back to the basics. And, what decision are you making that needs a number? So what we'd like to go back to some of those first questions. Data answered what question? Remember ISO 31000 established the context. So you need to frame why you're asking this question. Be very specific. What questions are you trying to answer? What is missing? And the goal is not just to create a believable estimate of the economic impact. The goal is to actually have something that can be used. And then now, okay, we'll give you a list if you want to really knock yourself out and go look at what type of costs could be in there. This is going to get extremely complex. Lost sales, corporate security risk, legal liability, cost of recall, loss to the GDP. And the quality-adjusted life years and disability-adjusted life years, quality and DALY, man, those are not great to be throwing around, publicly. So those are really tough ones. So there's a lot of ways you can go look at it. It sounds good to have a list, but when you really get in here to try to estimate it with some level of confidence or competence, it gets really challenging. We will take a moment to look at this whole GDP question. And I think it's something that's interesting for all of you as country folk. Deeper analysis of the USITC 1988 survey, that was a big early survey, results bring to light another more basic issue that does impact the impact of assessment for a country. Using the U.S. as an example, how to define the U.S. economic impact. So you want to do an economic impact? Okay, great. How do you define the U.S. economic impact? And how do you define a U.S. company? Is U.S. economic impact based on corporate revenue, corporate taxes paid, or consumer purchases? So say it's a Canadian company that sells product in the U.S. and U.S. consumers are deceived. Does that count? Now, what if it's Canadian product sold in Canada? Well, I guess that would probably be pretty clear. It didn't count. What about U.S. product made in the U.S. that's in Canada and counterfeited? Is that an economic impact? Is that lost sales here in the U.S.? Well, okay, that starts to get into it a little bit. It seems like that was clearer than I made mention. Is it a company based in the U.S. on being based in the New York Stock Exchange number of jobs in the U.S., number of jobs by a U.S. company anywhere in the world, contribution to the U.S. gross domestic product? So that gets to be a real big question, I think, that should be addressed if it really gets to the point of digging in. Does this analysis count traditionally recognized U.S. companies that have moved their company headquarters outside the U.S. for tax advantages or other strategic reasons? So you have a limited amount of dollars. So where do we focus this economic impact? So there's a lot of questions, even to the base question of what is the U.S. economy and what is a U.S. company. So conceptual methodology for governments, they've got to stand up to scrutiny. They've got to be fundamentally sound, reasonable to update, include changing variables, build upon currently available data, meet resource allocation decision-making needs, and inform decision-making and risk tolerance assessment. I think really the call to action is not first to look at an economic impact, it's to look at what process should be in place within a government. And this is something that we're helping with around the world to first conduct a vulnerability assessment at the country level, very high level, almost like cabinet level, and then look at a food fraud prevention cycle of how you would manage the information, and then the whole idea of applying enterprise risk for how much is enough. That starts to get to the question then of that's the method, the process that's in place, a decision-making method, risk tolerance level. At that point then you have very specific information and you can start to go look for things that you need to address. So do just one country level assessment and then that helps you identify how much is enough for data and that's where I think the most efficient focus would be. we have a lot of resources. Really appreciate the time to be here with all of you. There's a lot of ways you can work with us. There's a lot of training and education. A lot of people to thank. Really thankful for all the people here, and hope all of you feel comfortable contacting us if you have any questions. It doesn't have to be a project. It can just be pick up the phone. With that, I'll say thank you and take questions.